When I woke up that night, the bedroom was already filled with smoke, and the air had grown so thick and heavy that each breath felt like a struggle. Jason, jolting awake from his sleep, sprang to his feet, his voice booming like a loud bell as he shouted, "Laura, get up!" Everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. The fire had engulfed our house, devouring the rooms we had spent so long making our own. Flames danced across the walls, consuming photographs, furniture, wallpaper, all the little things that made up our life. We barely had time to grab our documents and a few belongings. When we ran outside, I turned back and watched as the roof caved in with a deafening crash. This wasn't just a fire, it was the end of an entire chapter. I stood barefoot on the cold grass, breathing in the searing smell of smoke as tears streamed down my cheeks. Jason held me, but his touch felt distant, almost foreign. "We'll rebuild everything," he said, trying to comfort me. "It's just stuff." But it didn't feel like I'd lost just things. The house had been our refuge, our beginning, and now it was nothing but a heap of ashes. The next morning, we sat in the car, staring at what remained of our home. Deciding to go to Michael's seemed like the only option. It was the place where I'd grown up, though it held many difficult memories. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Jason, on the other hand, seemed detached, already mentally diving back into work. His face showed exhaustion, but not emotion. When Michael answered our call, his voice was full of concern. "Of course, come over," he said. "There's always a place for you here." There was more warmth in those words than in our marriage over the past year. As the car turned onto the familiar path leading to my childhood home, my heart clenched with conflicting emotions. Surrounding us was the same lush garden where I had played as a child. The house, with its time-worn facade, still stood proudly in the middle of the yard. It looked a bit more weathered, but it was still just as familiar. This was the place where my mother had lived, where I had experienced the best and worst moments of my youth. Returning here now felt like both nostalgia and pain intertwined. Michael stepped onto the porch before we had even come to a full stop. He was dressed in an old sweater and jeans, with a touch of gray at his temples, yet he still carried himself with confidence and energy. His face lit up with a warm smile when he saw us. He hugged me so tightly that I felt a wave of childlike comfort wash over me. Then he shook Jason's hand, who smiled politely but seemed far less emotional. "I've prepared the guest room for you," Michael said, leading us inside. The house smelled of wood and a faint mustiness that somehow felt cozy. I noticed my mother's old books still lined the shelves, and her favorite blanket lay in the corner of the living room. Every corner of the house was imbued with her spirit, her presence, and it made my throat tighten. Jason and I went upstairs to unpack. The room was simple but cozy. An antique bed with carved legs, a wooden wardrobe, and a tiny window that offered a view of the garden. Jason quickly started organizing his papers, not even bothering to take in his surroundings. "How are you?" he asked, not looking up from his laptop. I shrugged. "I'm fine, just need to adjust." He nodded, already absorbed in his work. I could feel an invisible wall growing between us, and I didn't know how to tear it down. Downstairs, Michael had prepared tea and set the table. The three of us sat together as he spoke about my mother's habits, her love for the garden and the house itself. His voice was gentle, but there was pain in it. When he looked at me, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in a long time, genuine care. "Laura," he said suddenly, "this must be so hard for you. I know how much you've lost." His words, simple and direct, broke through the defenses I'd been trying to maintain. My chest tightened, and I lowered my gaze to my cup. Jason, on the other hand, remained indifferent. He merely waved it off. "Things will get better. It just takes time." After dinner, I helped Michael with the dishes. Our movements were synchronized, as if we had done this 1,000 times before. He asked me again how I was holding up. There was nothing casual in his tone, only a deep, almost instinctive desire to help. I gave a brief response, but his kindness stayed with me. Later, lying next to Jason in the dark, I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. His breathing was steady but cold, And in the room next door, where the air smelled of my mother's memory and old wood, was a man who, it seemed, truly saw me. The morning began with the smell of freshly brewed coffee. When I walked into the kitchen, I saw Michael standing by the stove, cooking breakfast while humming softly to himself. The sight was strangely soothing. The last time someone had cooked breakfast for me with such enthusiasm was probably my mother. "Good morning," he said with a smile. "How did you sleep?" "Not bad, thank you," I replied, sitting down at the table. Jason was nowhere to be seen. As usual, he had left early for the study Michael had offered him as a workspace. Michael placed a plate of scrambled eggs and bread in front of me. It was such a simple gesture, yet it touched me deeply. The two of us sat there, talking about little things. The weather, how the trees in the garden my mother loved so much had grown. I felt the tension in my chest ease slightly. "You're strong, Laura," he said suddenly, breaking the light-hearted conversation. His voice had turned serious, and he looked at me as if he could see every one of my vulnerabilities. "I know this isn't easy for you. Losing your home, the memories of your mother, and Jason. It seems like he's struggling with his own issues, too." I looked away, afraid he would see the tears welling up in my eyes. "Jason is just trying to cope in his own way," I said quietly. Michael didn't say anything, just nodded. His gaze held neither judgment nor pity, only understanding, and that was more than I could get from my own husband. The days passed monotonously. Jason buried himself deeper in his work, rarely leaving his makeshift office. He left early and came back late, often silent and distant. I tried to talk to him, but his responses were short, as if he wasn't even hearing me. Michael, on the other hand, was everywhere. He worked in the garden, offered to help with little tasks around the house, and shared stories about my mother. His presence was warm, like soft light breaking through the fog. One day, not knowing what else to do with myself, I wandered out into the garden. Michael was standing by a rose bush, trimming dry branches. When he saw me, he handed me the shears. "Want to give it a try?" I hesitated at first, but then agreed. We stood side by side, and he patiently explained how to care for the plants. His voice was calm and steady, and I felt almost safe beside him. "You used to love planting flowers when you were little," he said, watching as I carefully snipped away the leaves. I nodded, surprised that he remembered. My mother always said that the garden was a place where one could find peace, and I was beginning to feel that again. When our eyes met, I saw something in his gaze that I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just concern. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible connection that made my heart beat a little faster. That evening, as we sat down to dinner, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I felt heard. But it wasn't because of Jason. Michael, with his attention and care, had unintentionally started to fill the void that had grown in my heart. The night was quiet, apart from the soft tapping of rain on the roof. Jason had long gone to the study, saying he still had plenty of work to do. I stayed alone in the living room, flipping through the pages of an old family album I had found on one of the shelves. Each photograph brought memories to life. My mother in the garden with a basket of roses, Michael behind the wheel of our old family car, me, a little girl building houses out of sticks. It all felt so distant, as if it belonged to another person's life. I startled at the sound of footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw Michael. He looked thoughtful but smiled when our eyes met. "It's late," he said, sitting down on the couch next to me. "Why aren't you asleep?" I shrugged. "I can't sleep. Too many thoughts." He glanced at the album in my hands. "That old album? Amazing it's still here. Your mom and I spent so much time flipping through it. She loved telling stories about every single picture." I nodded, feeling the familiar tightness return to my throat. "Sometimes I feel like I can barely remember her," I admitted, staring at the image of her smiling face. "I'm afraid I'll forget her voice, her laughter." Michael was silent for a moment, then gently placed a hand on my shoulder. "You'll never forget her, Laura. She'll always be with you, in the way you act, the way you love, the way you care for others. She was always so proud of you." His words were so sincere that I couldn't hold back the quiet tears that followed. It wasn't a loud, overwhelming cry, but a soft, almost cleansing release. Michael moved closer, allowing me to lean against his shoulder. In that moment, I felt like I could allow myself to be vulnerable. When I lifted my head, our faces were close. His gaze was deep and piercing, as if he saw every pain, every fear within me and wasn't afraid of them. Our eyes locked and time seemed to stop. It was a moment of raw honesty, where masks fell and walls crumbled. His hand lightly brushed against mine. Our lips met in a soft, tentative kiss that somehow felt inevitable. Michael looked at me for a long time afterward before quietly saying, "I'm sorry. This shouldn't have happened." I shook my head. It's okay." But was it? When I returned to the bedroom, Jason was still at his computer. He didn't even notice I had been gone. His indifference suddenly felt painfully obvious. Lying in bed, I tried to sort through my emotions. What had happened with Michael was wrong, but why then did it feel like I had found something real for the first time in so long? In the days that followed, I found myself seeking out Michael. It was more than just wanting to talk. With him, I felt alive, real. It was both terrifying and irresistibly compelling. Jason, as usual, remained distant. He left early in the morning and returned late at night, consumed by his work. His indifference had become almost normal for me, though I knew it shouldn't be. We lived together, but inhabited different worlds. Meanwhile, I grew closer to Michael. Our connection wasn't a sudden spark. It was a slow, inevitable process, like water wearing down stone. We started spending more time together, walks in the garden, quiet conversations in the kitchen, shared memories of my mother. Every moment was filled with something I couldn't name, but it drew me to him more and more. One evening, when Jason had, as always, locked himself in the study, I stepped outside into the garden where Michael was tending to the flowers. The moonlight silvered the leaves, and the air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass. Michael looked up when he saw me and smiled. "Can't sleep?" he asked, wiping his hands on a cloth. I nodded. "You don't seem to be in a hurry to rest, either." He shrugged. "The garden is a place where I can forget everything. My therapy." We walked among the bushes and trees, his voice as calm as the evening breeze. He spoke about how hard it had been after my mother's death, how he had tried to find meaning in each day. I listened, feeling as though our souls were intertwining. "You know," he said suddenly, stopping, "you remind me of her. She also tried to keep everything inside, to hide her pain, but I always knew when she was struggling." His words touched something deep inside me. "You were her strength," I said, looking into his eyes. "And you're mine now," he replied. His voice was quiet, but there was something profoundly resonant in those words. We stood so close that I could hear his breath. When he leaned toward me again, I didn't resist. Our kiss lasted longer than the first time. That night we spent together. Jason had started to notice that something had changed. His glances grew more piercing, and his questions became more direct. "You've been so distant lately," he said one evening as we sat down for dinner. His tone wasn't angry, but there was a note of concern in it. I tried to dodge the topic, to distract him, but the words caught in my throat. "It's just stress," I mumbled, avoiding his gaze. He remained silent for a long time before nodding, clearly unsatisfied with my answer. I knew the game I was playing with fire was reaching its climax. Each day, it became harder to hide what was happening between Michael and me. We both understood that we were standing on the edge of a precipice, but neither of us could make ourselves step back. One evening, when Jason stayed late in his study, Michael suggested we take a walk in the garden. We wandered among the shadows, illuminated by the faint glow of the moon, and I felt the tension inside me blend with a dangerous excitement. "This can't go on," he said, stopping near an old oak tree. His voice carried exhaustion, but it wasn't directed at me. It was at the situation. "I know," I whispered, not knowing what else to say. He took my hand, his fingers warm and steady. "Laura, I don't want to hurt you, but this is getting harder. I can't just be your support when I want to be so much more." His words felt like a confession I already knew, but had been too afraid to hear. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I realized how far I was drifting from my marriage with each passing step. Jason no longer hid his frustration. He followed me with his eyes, every movement of mine arousing his suspicion. In his gaze, I could see the unspoken questions he hadn't yet dared to voice, but that were inching closer to the truth. That evening, as I was tidying up the kitchen, he walked in and sat at the table. His voice was cold and calm, which made his words cut even deeper. "Laura, what's going on? You're like a stranger. Something's wrong, and I can feel it." I tried to say something, but every excuse sounded hollow, even to me. "It's just, a lot has been going on, Jason," I said, avoiding his eyes. He slammed his hand on the table, making me flinch. "Do you think I don't see it? I'm not blind. You leave, you disappear for hours. Something is happening, and I want to know what it is." My hands started to tremble, and I felt the walls closing in around me. The secret that Michael and I had been so carefully guarding was on the verge of being exposed. Jason wouldn't back down until he knew the truth. In that moment, I realized that everything was heading toward a reckoning, and time was running out. It all happened so quickly that I barely had time to process how our secret became exposed. That evening, Jason came home earlier than usual, his footsteps in the hallway louder and firmer than normal. I was in the kitchen with Michael, talking about something trivial, but when I heard the front door open, a chill ran down my spine. Michael immediately understood what was happening. "Laura, go," he whispered, but I was frozen in place. It felt as if my body refused to obey. Jason entered the kitchen, his face showing a mix of exhaustion and irritation. He saw us together, and for a moment, something flashed in his eyes that I couldn't decipher. Suspicion? Anger? Pain? "What are you two doing here?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly steady, though tension simmered beneath the surface. "We were just talking," I began, but my voice wavered. It felt like a confession, even though I hadn't said anything outright. "Just talking?" he repeated, stepping closer. His gaze moved from me to Michael and back again. He was too perceptive not to see what was happening between us. Michael, as if sensing the unbearable weight of the silence, took a step forward. "Jason, I need to say something. This is my fault. He faltered, and his voice suddenly lost its strength. Jason turned sharply toward him, his face growing pale. "Your fault? What are you talking about, Michael?" Anger began to flare in his eyes like a fire ready to consume everything around it. I couldn't stay silent any longer. "Jason, please, listen to me." My words came out as a plea, but it only seemed to fuel his anger. "Listen? Listen to what, Laura?" he shouted, his voice filled with rage. "You spend more time with Michael than with your own husband. Do you think I haven't noticed? Do you think I don't feel you slipping away from me?" He waved his hand as if trying to dispel the fog of doubt that had been clouding our marriage for so long. I tried to explain, but Jason wasn't listening. His anger wasn't just directed at me, but at Michael too. "And you," he turned to his stepfather, "did you even think about what a betrayal this is? You're like a father to me, for God's sake, and here you are stealing my wife?" Michael tried to say something, but Jason cut him off. "I want to hear it from her," he snapped. His eyes bore into mine, demanding the truth. I felt tears begin to stream down my cheeks. "Jason, I don't know what to say. Everything is so tangled. I never wanted it to happen this way." "You didn't want this?" He laughed bitterly. "You knew exactly what you were doing. And so did you, Michael. Both of you knew." The silence that followed his words was deafening. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice calm but laced with pain. "Jason, I'm leaving. You're right. This is my fault. This was my mistake, but I never intended to hurt you." "It's too late," Jason replied coldly, turning away. Michael looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something I couldn't decipher. A goodbye, regret, Or perhaps something more. Then he left, leaving me and Jason alone in the empty room. As the door closed behind him, I felt something inside me shatter completely. Jason stood with his back to me, his shoulders trembling, though I couldn't tell if it was from anger or pain. "How could you?" he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How could you betray me like this?" I didn't know what to say. In that moment, I realized I had lost both men who meant everything to me. The house, which once felt warm and welcoming, was now filled with only cold and silence. After Michael left, the shadow of his presence still lingered in the air. It seemed as if even the walls remembered what had happened. I sat in the kitchen, listening to the clock on the wall mark each second, every tick sounding like the strike of a hammer. Jason didn't speak to me. He silently packed his things and moved into the guest room. He didn't need to say anything. His look, filled with disappointment and pain, said it all. We were no longer partners, not even friends. We lived under the same roof like strangers trapped by a shared past. The next morning, he didn't show up for breakfast. I sat at the table for a long time, staring at my cooling cup of coffee before gathering the courage to go to his door. Knocking softly, I heard only a muted, "Come in." His voice sounded even, almost lifeless.